Forget what you think you know about royalty. Because what happened behind closed palace doors on the night of October 20, 1819, wasn't sacred, it was nightmarish. When a teenage bride soiled herself on the wedding bed of Spain's most depraved king, she didn't just disgrace the crown, she exposed the sickness beneath it. By candlelight, the royal palace of Madrid shimmered like a holy vision. Outside, the people of Spain toasted with wine and fireworks to what they believed was a blessed union, a holy alliance between piety and power. But inside the palace walls, in a room sealed off from the world, a girl waited. Not a queen. A girl. Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony. 16. Raised in a convent. Virgin in body, mind, and even vocabulary. She thought babies came from angels. She thought her husband would be a fair-haired prince. She was wrong. When the heavy oak door creaked open, the scent of wine and sweat hit her like a slap. And in its frame stood not a prince, but King Ferdinand VII of Spain, bloated, blotched, 35 years old, his breath thick with brandy and his eyes darker than the shadows behind him. And then she saw it. She didn't scream because she was being dramatic. She screamed because what she saw was something no child should ever see. And Ferdinand? He smiled. He wasn't a fool. He knew what she saw. He'd seen that look of horror before, from his first wife, from palace maids, even from the prostitutes who couldn't hide their trembling. He didn't mind. He'd long since accepted that his body wasn't made for affection. It was made for fear. When Maria Josepha bolted from the bed in a panic, rosary beads flying, he didn't chase her to comfort her. He chased her like a predator chases prey. Imagine the most powerful man in the nation, naked, red with rage and grotesquely aroused, stumbling after a terrified teenager through a bedroom filled with relics of the Virgin Mary. She wept. She pleaded. She slipped and fell. And then, the moment that would be whispered about for decades, she lost control of her body. She soiled herself. Right there on the marriage bed of Spain. Not out of defiance. Out of terror. A holy ceremony had ended in filth, and the King of Spain stood above it, dumbstruck. Ferdinand recoiled in disgust. "This is no queen," he bellowed to the attendants outside. "Queens are supposed to smell of civet, not of pigs." And just like that, the sacred union was over. He stormed out of the room naked, his monstrous anatomy swinging like a weapon, as shocked servants averted their eyes. Maria Josepha was left trembling on a stained bed, still clutching the rosary like it could undo what had just happened. This wasn't just a personal humiliation. It was a national disgrace. The Pope would hear of it. The nobles would whisper. The clergy would panic. A virgin queen had defecated on her wedding night, and it was Spain's king who had driven her to it. And this was only the beginning. If this is your first time on the History Scar, I need you to do one thing. Hit subscribe. Because if we don't tell the dark side of power, nobody will. And if you're the type who refuses to subscribe, tell us why in the comments. The rest of us will wait. Because what came next wasn't just a crisis of marriage. It was a crisis of monarchy, of biology, of a king whose deformity would unleash death, war, and shame for generations. And it all began on a bed soaked in shame. The royal court called it a tragedy. The priests called it a test of virtue. But the truth, stripped of royal polish, was much uglier. Because Ferdinand VI's curse didn't begin with Maria Josepha. It began with what he carried between his legs, and what he never truly understood how to use. The condition was real. Medical science, limited as it was in the early 19th century, struggled to name it. But modern historians agree. Macrogenitosomia, a grotesque enlargement of the male genitalia, marked Ferdinand from puberty. One foreign diplomat wrote that the Spanish prince carried himself with discomfort, as though every motion was a burden. A royal physician, Dr. José María de la Fuente, left notes that would have been dismissed as vulgar, had they not been written with clinical seriousness. His Majesty is afflicted with an enlargement so disproportionate in length and girth that ordinary copulation may cause injury, even bleeding, to the female partner. But it wasn't just size. It was the shape. Descriptions, repeated across letters and reports, speak of an appendage thin as a taper at the base, and bulging grotesquely at the head, resembling not the instrument of love but one of torture. It wasn't just difficult. It was incompatible with human intimacy. And no one learned that lesson more painfully than Maria Antonia of Naples, Ferdinand's first wife. She was his cousin. Another political marriage. Another teenager promised to a prince. She was 17. He was just entering manhood, if one could call it that. On their wedding night in 1802, there was no grand consummation. No passion. Just awkward silence. The prince, as Maria Antonia would later write, stood there confused, trembling, and afraid. He stared. He fondled. He prodded. And then he gave up. Not for a night. Not for a week. For nearly 11 months, the marriage remained untouched. It became court gossip. A prince who couldn't perform. A bride who cried herself to sleep. An entire monarchy held hostage by one man's inability to be a husband. Her mother, Queen Maria Carolina of Naples, sent frantic letters to Vienna. My daughter is fading. She is weeping day and night. The prince feels nothing. Attempts to stimulate him are met with silence. There is no pleasure. There is no function. Eventually, a Catholic confessor, a priest, was sent in to explain the mechanics of intercourse. He spoke slowly, carefully, drawing diagrams like a teacher with a backward student. When Ferdinand finally managed the act, the damage was instant. Maria Antonia suffered 2 miscarriages. Internal bleeding. Constant infection. The royal midwives described her condition with a single word: shattered. She died at 21. The official cause? Fever. But the truth? A womb torn by a man who saw sex as duty, not intimacy. For most men this would be a tragedy. For Ferdinand it was a turning point. The boy who once froze in fear at the sight of his bride's bare skin now became obsessed with his own power. Not political power. Sexual power. He had tasted control. And humiliation, when inverted, becomes cruelty. Ferdinand began to see his deformity not as a curse but a weapon. A tool that made women cry, made priests stammer, and made nobles fear the royal bedchamber. He would never again be awkward. He would never again be laughed at. From that moment forward, Ferdinand VII wasn't just a broken man. He was a man rewriting the rules of desire, turning his body into a throne, and every woman into a subject to be conquered, or broken. And his next conquest would not come from brothels or court gossip. It would come dressed in white, praying for mercy. A convent girl named Maria Josefa. The next chapter in a nightmare that Spain would never forget. Maria Antonia died in 1806, leaving behind no heir and no legacy but whispers of pain. Her death should have sobered the young Ferdinand. Instead, it unshackled him. Now a widower, he was free. And what he did with that freedom revealed the monster hiding beneath the royal robes. For the next decade, Ferdinand would transform from a fumbling, insecure prince into something far more dangerous. A man who believed his deformity made him special, feared, untouchable. Spain, meanwhile, was burning. Napoleon's armies had invaded, the monarchy had collapsed, and Ferdinand himself was imprisoned in France. But instead of reflecting in captivity, he brooded. He dreamed. And when he returned to the throne in 1814, he wasn't a king reborn. He was a predator unleashed. He re-entered Madrid as a hero, hailed by conservatives and clerics as the restorer of divine order. But behind closed doors, Ferdinand had no interest in God, governance, or glory. He wanted flesh. And he found it, in the alleys of Madrid's red light district, where the lamps were dim and names were rarely remembered. His favorite haunt was a brothel run by Pepa la Malaguine, a woman known as much for her discretion as her depravity. She didn't just run a brothel. She curated experiences. And for Ferdinand she reserved the worst of them. But the king never went alone. He brought with him a circle of noble-born degenerates, aristocrats who'd long abandoned dignity in favor of indulgence. They called themselves La Podredumbre Real, the royal rot, and together they turned Spain's capital into their playground of sin. Inside Pepa's den, the king removed more than just his crown. He removed all illusion of civility. Witnesses, courtiers, servants, even foreign spies, described the same repulsive ritual. Ferdinand, drunk on cheap wine, pulling down his trousers and challenging his entourage to what they called la medition nocturna, the nightly measuring. One by one each man would expose himself, laughing, jeering, boasting. But Ferdinand always won. Not because he was proud, but because he was obsessed with being feared even in intimacy. They gave him a nickname, whispered only in the darkest corners of the palace. Al bien dotado, the well-endowed one. But this was more than a sick party game. It was a test of dominance. Because once the measuring was done, Ferdinand would choose. A virgin. A widow. A servant. It didn't matter. She bled even better. And then he began to collect. Blood-stained cloth. Labeled. Dated. Folded. Stored in a cedar chest beneath his bed. It started with curiosity. Then it became habit. Then it became ritual. Each cloth represented a woman conquered, as he called it. Many were paid. Some were coerced. Others, historians now believe, had no choice at all. It was a trophy room of trauma. a museum of innocence destroyed. If this disgusts you, if the thought of a king turning innocence into sport makes your stomach churn, subscribe right now. Not for me. For every woman whose name was never written down. And if you still won't hit that button, say it in the comments. While Ferdinand counted virgins, Spain lost an empire. The colonies in the Americas, Argentina, Mexico, Colombia, Chile, broke free one by one. The once mighty Spanish crown crumbled, bleeding territory faster than it could sign decrees. The economy collapsed. Starvation gripped the countryside. Political reformers were silenced, imprisoned, or hanged. But none of that mattered in the velvet-draped chambers of papal Malaguine. There, the King of Spain was still a god with an appetite, and a deformity. Every woman was a canvas for his cruelty. Every night, another stain on the silk. And yet, the court said nothing. The church looked away, because Ferdinand was the king, and kings were above shame. But how can a man so broken rule a nation? How can a throne built on blood and silk hope to stand? What Ferdinand could not take by seduction, he would take by force. And when the palace ran out of prey, he turned again to the one place he had left unfinished. His young bride. The one who had once soiled herself in terror. She would not escape him again. She was only 16 when she was married to him. And when that door closed on their wedding night, she wasn't entering a marriage. She was stepping into a chamber of horror disguised as a royal suite. After that night, the one soaked in tears, humiliation, and human waste, Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony was never the same. Neither was Ferdinand. He didn't touch her again for over a week. Not out of mercy but out of revulsion. He raged to his attendants, calling her a disgrace, a filthy child, unworthy of his bed. But behind the anger was something worse, wounded pride. He hadn't conquered her. He hadn't broken her. And for Ferdinand that meant failure. Maria Josepha remained in her chambers, traumatized and confused. She prayed constantly. Not for love. Not even for safety. But for understanding. No one had explained to her what had just happened, or what was supposed to happen. In her world, in the quiet halls of her convent upbringing, sex didn't exist. Children came from heaven. Pregnancy was a blessing bestowed by angels, not the result of some grotesque physical act. The idea that her body was to be used by a man, this man, was so foreign, so vile that she rejected it entirely. When her attendants tried to explain what would come next, she accused them of heresy. God would never choose such a filthy method for creating life, she whispered. You are testing my virtue. This is a temptation from the devil. Ferdinand, whose pride had already been mutilated by past failures, now faced something new, a wife who refused him. Not because she was cold or disloyal, but because she genuinely believed that sleeping with her husband was a sin. For months he tried. Gently at first, then with threats. But every time he entered her room, she clutched her rosary like a weapon and turned her face toward the Virgin Mary. The court began to talk. Ambassadors sent private dispatches back to Vienna, to Prussia, to France. The queen remains untouched. The king is humiliated. The Spanish crown has no heir and no dignity. Ferdinand's rage simmered until he did something no monarch had done before. He wrote a letter to the Pope. Pope Pius VII, elderly, war-weary, and deeply conservative, had seen kingdoms rise and fall. But nothing could have prepared him for what arrived on his desk in the autumn of 1820. A desperate plea from the King of Spain, begging the Vicar of Christ to convince his wife to let him sleep with her. The Pope's response survives to this day, preserved in the Vatican archives. And though couched in ecclesiastical language, it cannot mask the absurdity of the moment. To Her Majesty the Queen Consort of Spain, it begins, know that within the holy bounds of marriage the act of union is not only permitted, but sacred. To deny thy husband his conjugal right is to deny God's command to be fruitful. In fulfilling your duties you do not sin, you obey. The letter was delivered with trembling hands. Maria Josepha wept as she read it. Not out of joy. Out of defeat. Even the Pope, she thought, had been deceived. She agreed. But only under conditions. Each time her husband approached her, she would recite the full rosary. She would keep her eyes closed. She would think only of the Virgin Mary. And she would not speak. What followed was 10 years of marital relations that were more ritual than romance. Ferdinand, once the braggart of the brothels, reduced to a silent figure thrusting in the dark while his wife mouthed prayers for forgiveness. He called it piety. She called it duty. But it was something else entirely. It was purgatory. 10 years. No children. No joy. No love. Just the sound of whispered Ave Marias echoing through royal bedchambers soaked in silence. To the outside world they were king and queen. But behind those gilded doors, they were strangers trapped in a cycle of forced submission and spiritual desperation. And Ferdinand, humiliated yet again, would not make the same mistake twice. The next woman he married would not be chosen for her purity. She would be chosen for her purpose. By the time Ferdinand VII buried his third wife, he had buried more than just a queen, he had buried his final excuse. 3 marriages, 2 dead queens, 1 stillborn child, no heir. He was 45. Bloated, syphilitic and paranoid. The whispers had returned. The king was cursed. The throne was doomed. The Bourbon line would die with him. But Ferdinand was not ready to surrender. He needed a 4th wife. Not for love. Not even for companionship. He needed a womb that could work. A vessel that could survive him long enough to give him what Spain demanded. In 1829 he married Maria Cristina of Bourbon II Sicilies, his own niece, because in the Spanish royal court, genetics mattered far less than obedience. But Maria Cristina was not a girl from a convent. She was not a wide-eyed virgin. She was 23, educated and quietly ruthless. She had read the letters, heard the stories. She knew exactly what she was walking into, and she came prepared. Where others had prayed, she planned. Her strategy began with the man who knew Ferdinand better than anyone. Dr. Antonio Hernandez, royal physician and silent witness to decades of failed attempts and fatal outcomes. The problem, Hernandez believed, was not just size or shape, but physics. He wrote in confidential records later unearthed by historians. If the king's instrument is a dagger, then it must be sheathed with care. We must reduce the depth of penetration, without insulting His Majesty's pride. And so, they created it. A device so absurd in concept it would be dismissed if not for its results. Una Almohadilla Real, the royal cushion. Crafted from the finest silk and stuffed with down, the cushion looked like a luxurious bedroom ornament. But at its center was a precisely measured hole, exactly 4 centimeters deep, designed not for comfort but containment. Only the tip would pass. The rest shielded. Maria Cristina presented it to Ferdinand as a gift. Not as a limitation but as a solution to a royal problem. She told him his greatness required adaptation. That his body was a divine challenge, and this cushion, a divine compromise. It worked. Within 3 months, Maria Cristina was pregnant. For the first time in decades, the Spanish court held its breath in hope instead of horror. On October 10, 1830, the cannons of Madrid thundered in celebration. A healthy daughter was born, Isabella. And 2 years later, a second girl followed, Luisa Fernanda. Ferdinand finally had his heirs. But now a new problem emerged: the law. According to Salic law, imported centuries earlier from France, women could not inherit the Spanish throne, which meant his daughters were, by law, illegitimate rulers. And his brother, Don Carlos, stood next in line. But Ferdinand had not endured humiliation, medical engineering, and a decade of marital purgatory just to hand his crown to a man. In 1830 he issued the Pragmatic Sanction, overturning centuries of legal precedent to allow his daughters, specifically Isabella, to succeed him. It was a seismic act of defiance. Not just against tradition but against his own family. Don Carlos, furious and humiliated, began organizing resistance. Armed resistance. The throne that Ferdinand had engineered into existence would soon ignite a war. A war that would claim tens of thousands of lives. A war fought over a girl born from silk, blood, and calculation. This channel is called The History Scar for a reason. These aren't bedtime stories. They are the wounds history left behind. So if you've made it this far and still haven't subscribed, ask yourself why. Then scroll down and explain it to us. Honestly, we'll read them all. Ferdinand had done the impossible. He had outmaneuvered nature, tradition, and shame to create an heir. But what he could never control were the consequences. Ferdinand VII died on September 29, 1833. Spain, exhausted by his rule and bracing for civil war, barely paused to mourn. His widow Maria Cristina wasted no time. She had 2 daughters to protect and a throne to defend. What the king left behind wasn't just a succession crisis. It was a house of secrets and she needed to clean it. Quietly, she ordered a private inventory of the royal chambers. Not the public rooms, not the throne halls. The private rooms. Ferdinand's personal space. No fanfare. No courtiers. Just trusted servants and locked doors. And in one corner of his private study, inside a cedar chest wrapped in silk and sealed with an iron clasp, they found something horrifying. Not documents. Not jewels. Not letters. cloth. Dozens of cloths. Each one stained with blood, carefully folded, and labeled in the king's own hand. Each square bore a name, a date, sometimes a place. Isabel, palace servant, January 1823. Carmen, paper housemaid, March 1821. Maria, widow of Vanes, September 1824. One by one they catalogued them. The total number has never been officially released, but eyewitnesses from the palace claim the stack was thick as a royal ledger. At first, Maria Cristina believed she was looking at a relic of past cruelty, a sick collection from the king's brothel days. But then something darker emerged. As dates were cross-referenced with official records, a pattern began to form. The trophies matched political moments, specifically acts of violence. Each uprising, each execution, each crushed rebellion. In the days that followed, Ferdinand would add multiple stained cloths to his collection. After the execution of liberal generals in 1820, after the failed constitutional revolt in 1823, after the hanging of student leaders in Seville in 1825, it became clear, Ferdinand's lust was triggered by blood. Not metaphorically, literally. The more violence he inflicted on his enemies in public, the more women he sought to conquer in private. The blood of rebellion fed his appetite. The crown and the brothel became one. And in that archive, one cloth stood out. Anna, 15 years, daughter of Colonel Bermudez, February 1823. Colonel Rafael Bermudez had been a decorated officer in the Liberal Army. He supported the Constitution of 1812, believed in free speech, civil law, the rights of the people. When Ferdinand returned to power, he made an example of him. Bermudez was publicly executed in the Plaza Mayor. His head was displayed for 2 days. What the people didn't know was what happened the night before. Anna, his daughter, only 15, had gone to the palace to beg for her father's life. She never came back the same. The servants remembered her arriving in a plain dress, clutching a letter. She waited for hours. When she finally left, her eyes were hollow. She didn't speak. 2 weeks later, she disappeared entirely. And in Ferdinand's cedar chest, her name appeared. This wasn't seduction. This wasn't adultery. This was revenge, vengeance on the body of a child, used as leverage against a man who dared to challenge the king. Ferdinand hadn't just turned sex into conquest. He had turned it into policy. If you're not shaking right now, rewind and listen again. This isn't fiction. This happened. If the history scar doesn't tell it, no one will. Subscribe if you believe the victims should be remembered. Comment if you can't. Maria Cristina, to her credit, did not let the archive survive. She ordered it burned, destroyed. But not before several witnesses saw it. Not before the names were written down. Not before history had already absorbed the rot of what Ferdinand left behind. And the most terrifying question remains unanswered. How many names were never written down at all? Ferdinand's enemies were executed in public. His victims died in silence. When Ferdinand VII finally died in 1833, there were no tears in the streets of Madrid. No mourning bells rung with sincerity. The people had endured too much. Too many lies, too many hangings, too many nights of silence after screams echoed from the palace windows. But death did not end his damage. It unleashed it. Because with no son to inherit the throne, and with Salic law abolished by royal decree, the crown passed to his daughter, the infant Isabella II, barely 3 years old. Spain had never crowned a girl before. And Ferdinand's younger brother, Don Carlos, refused to accept it. He declared himself the rightful king. His followers, ultra-conservative nobles and clerics, took up arms. What began as a legal dispute exploded into the First Carlist War, a bloody, brutal civil conflict that tore the country apart for 7 years. Tens of thousands died. The irony was cruel. A king who had spent his life unable to perform a single normal act of love had, through sheer force and surgical invention, fathered a daughter who would ignite a war he wouldn't live to see. All because of a cushion, a compromise, and a crown too fragile to survive without a male heir. But even as war raged, the damage was far from over. Isabella II, when she came of age, inherited more than just her father's throne. She inherited his appetites. Her reign would be scandalous, disjointed, and riddled with rumors, from secret lovers to illegitimate children to whispered affairs with both men and women. The people began to believe that madness ran in the blood, that whatever had warped Ferdinand had not died with him. The monarchy, once divine, was now viewed with contempt. No longer sacred. No longer trusted. Just a diseased. The nobility gossiped. The clergy winced. The people turned to revolution. And in 1868, Isabella II was forced to abdicate and flee the country. The Bourbon dynasty, which Ferdinand had quite literally engineered into existence with a silk pillow and royal desperation, was driven out by the very people it once ruled. And then, as if to insult tradition one final time, Maria Cristina, queen consort, widow and regent of Spain, did something that sent shockwaves through the aristocracy. She married her bodyguard. Not a duke. Not a foreign prince. A common soldier. A man with no title, no fortune, no royal blood. Just strong arms and quiet loyalty. It was the final rejection of everything Ferdinand had stood for. Power without compassion. Bloodlines without humanity. A monarchy built on abuse, secrecy and shame. He had left behind a throne, but no respect. A legacy but no honor. Spain, once the greatest empire in the world, had become a kingdom of ghosts, ruled by the whispers of a dead man and the stains he left behind. And in the end, it wasn't the battlefield that changed the course of history. It was the bed. Not the cannon fire. Not the proclamations. The blood on silk sheets. You're not the same person who started this video. And neither is Spain after Ferdinand. Subscribe to the History Scar if you want more than dates and kings, if you want to know what they really did behind those palace walls. And if you still won't subscribe, tell the rest of us why. Maybe, just maybe, we'll understand. And if you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, liked, shared, and never forgotten, then don't let them fade into silence. History doesn't clean itself. It stains. And it scars.